like this, I will be able to move here. Sorry? You will go here for the presentation.
Yeah, and Gloria?
And Gloria, oh,
You wanted
here
to
she
sit
is.
here with you. Let her sit.
Okay, then,
I'll just go there. It's fine.
are you sure? Okay, so we'll frame it like this. We'll ping pong a bit. We'll ping pong a bit between us to push the discussion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
I'm looking forward to that.
No, you deal with it. No ping pong.
Rabia, can you just Tomai just wants to check.
They can get?
Gloria hasn't shown up.
Okay.
Just so you know, I mean. So I would just.
Okay, in this case, Rabia sits here.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then Gloria, we just bring on at the
Rabia,
end.
Gloria is not here, so we sit here, and then she'll come at the end. I don't have a presentation.
It's only Rabia.
You start? Hello? Yes, we have sound. We have some people in the room. We'll send great vibes to get even more people into the room, right? Because we're going to speak about something very, very important here. Being at the COP in Egypt, the first African COP, we're going to speak about the role of energy in Africa. So this joint side event, and I welcome you all, is a side event of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, of Sustainable Energy Africa, and of Renewable, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century. My name is Ranadip, I'm heading Renewable, and I welcome you very warmly to be with us. So the topic we're discussing here is an African energy transformation, meeting development and climate objectives. The reality is energy is an enabler for many activities. Energy is at the heart of our economic activities and of many of the societal activities. The reality also is, and we're here at COP, so we all are aware about that we need to move out of fossil fuel to move to renewable energy and efficiency, or efficiency and renewable energy. It's not one or the other, it's both together. The reality is that we need to make those transformations we're talking about just transformations, and that we need to look into renewable energy as the fuel for economic development in Africa. And I'm very, very happy to have a great panel with me to discuss those things, and a great keynote speaker to discuss topics like mitigation, adaptation, yes, but the economic development, innovation, access to energy services, and also the fact that technology is not enough. We're not only speaking about a fuel switch, we're speaking about new approaches and shaping a new economy and society. So with me, I have Rabia Firouki from IRENA. Welcome, Rabia. And she will, before I'm going to move to the panel, introduce and give us her keynote to speak. Thank you, Rabia.
Thank you so much, Rana. Thank you for being here with distinguished panelists. I'm going to give you just a few highlights of a report we have published about 8 months ago on renewable energy market analysis, Africa and its regions. And I'm really happy to tell you also that we have translated the whole report. It's a really long one. So you can find it on IRENA's website, both in English and in French. I'm going to be very quick and just give a few highlights. So basically, Africa is home to a fifth of the world population. We all know that, 1.3 billion people, but 6% only of global energy demand and 3% of electricity demand. These are numbers that we need to keep in mind all the time when we're thinking about Africa. These are numbers you know, all of you, but I thought it was good when opening this discussion that we were reminded of these numbers. Electrification rate is about 46%. You all know the numbers in terms of people without access to electricity or to clean cooking. So meeting the objectives of development will require scaling up energy resources. So as of today, only 3% of the world installed renewables-based power capacity is located in Africa. Another striking number, even though potential is huge. Just to look at solar, and at IRENA we have the global atlas that looks at potential for renewables, for all renewable energy technologies. So 7,900 gigawatt potential, and yet only a few percentage of renewables-based capacity. Now, more alarming is the fact that cumulative investment in renewables for Africa are just 2% in the last 2 decades. And more alarming is the fact that 75% of the investment in the last decade went to just 4 countries in Africa. So that's to give a picture of the investment patterns. And the last publication we launched is about targets, renewable energy targets. And there we see that the trends will continue. If we look at announced targets and NDCs, etc., we don't see any major shift in terms of the investment patterns for renewables. So we all know that the energy transition is not a panacea. It's not going to resolve all development issues, but it is an opportunity that needs to be grasped in order to increase benefits from the investments in energy. And we do at IRENA have a socioeconometric modeling exercise where we take the energy transition pathway, the technological one, and we translate it into socioeconomic variables. So in terms of GDP, in terms of jobs, and in terms of welfare. And the thing is, obviously these numbers are all positive, as you can see on the screen, but they also hide really very severe disparities between regions and countries. This is a global number for the continent. To take advantage of the opportunity that the energy transition can bring, we need a comprehensive policy framework. We've been pushing this comprehensive policy framework for many, many years at IRENA. And I think increasingly after COVID, and you see it also in the COP, I think that the message is slowly coming through that we cannot look at energy in isolation of the rest of the economy, this planet, the society. So those interlinkages, the systemic interlinkages, are extremely important to consider. Just a couple of points to finish. We really need to look at the structural realities that need to be addressed when we're speaking about the energy transition. Many countries remain dependent on the production and exports of fossil fuels. The institutional fabrics, the sectoral structures, and the investment patterns often reinforce this dependency. Another very important element that we need to look at is the fact that the historically ingrained developments that have created structural dependencies, and I'm talking here about commodity dependency, technology dependency, trade dependency, are there, and we can't just overlook them. So many countries lack the strength and depth of supply chains that are necessary to support renewables-based energy transitions. And this is where our policy framework, the broader policy framework that we have been advocating for at IRENA, comes handy, because this is where we speak about industrial policies that need to accompany the energy transition. I've been to a few events, and I was quite shocked that some of the discussion continues to be a discussion of how to secure energy supply for the global north. You have all these initiatives on, energy exchange between Europe and the MENA region, between Europe and the GCC, etc. But the fact is that everything we hear from the messaging, in particular from the decision makers, is that basically we need so much supply, so much energy, and therefore you should build an infrastructure that can support our energy demand. And there's nothing there in terms of industrial policy, in terms of creating or establishing an industrial fabric that could bring development and local value creation. The second point I wanted to make is about the misalignments that can happen in different sectors, in particular in the labor markets, with this energy transition that should be addressed also from the onset. I mean, we always say, even in our work at IRENA, that the job gains from the energy-related transition, the energy transition-related technology will bring more jobs than the losses. But the problem is that labor markets don't function just because you press a button on it. You have temporal misalignments, you have spatial misalignments, you have educational misalignments, and all of these have to be, of course, supported from the onset with very solid labor market policies, skills and trainings policies, etc. So in the end, the report that we did is calls for the concept of a Green Deal. I know a lot of people don't like the idea of an African Green Deal, and we're thinking about how we could, find a better term for this initiative. But what we're working on right now is a sort of contour of a pact, let's call it a pact, where we would have different elements that are required for a transition towards an energy transition that would be a green transition, but that could support development objectives of the continent. So in that, I think the intra-African cooperation and South-South African cooperation is really fundamental. And I hope that many of you can join us in thinking about this pact or deal or whatever we will call it, in order to establish or define something that would make sense. Right now, it's many stakeholders that are involved with us, a few institutions. As we move along, and in a few months, we would like to bring also African institutions to get their buy-in, to get their insights, and see how the pillars of this pact could be further developed and could make sense in the current context of an energy transition that is sustainable. Thank you again, Rana, and if you have questions, you can.
Thank you so much, Rabia. So we're very excited about this framework because I think it's pointing us to the fact that we're thinking about the future we need to build now, But we cannot build the future with the rules of the past. So we need to redefine the rules, and not only the rules of the energy system, but of the economy, of trade, of labor markets, etc. So this also brings me to the fact, don't expect a session where we'll be politically correct, because this is not going to bring us where we need to be. And this also means that we will have hopefully a very lively discussion. And if you have questions in the middle of the discussions, please participate. And for doing so, I invite actually all of you to move here, because we're not so many people, and I think it's going to change the discussions. We have spent so many time in meeting rooms where we couldn't hear each other, so join us. That's great. The gentleman in the last line, you're also allowed to come to us, because I'm sure you have things to say. And you're also allowed to mix between women and men. It's a really interesting game here. So, thank you for playing the game. I'm very happy actually to have with Rabia some other voices we need to have in those discussions. So to start with, I need to apologize. We didn't hear back from one of our speakers. She's coming? Okay, so I'll introduce her now so that you know who she is. But so Gloria Magombo, Ministry of Energy and Power Development in Zimbabwe. And obviously, when we're speaking about changing the games, governments are important to be around the table. Not only national governments, but also city governments. So we have with us, and sorry, I'm now jumping to another paper, because there has been a change, I think. Yes. Excuse me for that. Khadani Mulaudzi, I hope I pronounced this correctly, from C40, City Governments. So thank you for being here. I'm deliberately not speaking about the titles, because we all have thoughts, so I hope that's okay too. Then from the private sector, we have with us Laura Corcoran from Uptech Africa, so private business in Africa. And we have Ahmed Abdelatif from the International Center for Conflict Resolution and Peacekeeping and Peace Building. Welcome to all of you. So you have heard some, I think, rather thought-provoking facts and figures, but also principles on what we need to build up. I would like to kick us off to hear, hello Gloria, hi, nice meeting us here. So I give you the time to join us, and then I'll turn back to you. So Laura, maybe what do you think when you see those numbers and when you see the perspectives we need to have, and the fact that we actually need to apply other rules than the rules from the past?
Thanks so much for the question, and thanks for having me to speak here today. So I think when I look at the presentation, thanks for sharing that. One of the things that stood out was that we have 570 million people who are still lacking electricity. And to put this into context, why I'm here. So Uptech Africa is an engineering, procurement, and construction company that is headquartered in Uganda, but we also have offices and operate in South Sudan, Central African Republic, Sierra Leone, Niger, Liberia, and DRC. So if you look at where we are working in the frontier markets that have the lowest electrification rates. And why that matters is that when we're talking about the energy transition, you have to take it for granted that a lot of these places there is no energy transition, it's just bringing the energy in the first place. And that's the reality of what we're doing on the ground. So when we look at it, we think that it has to start at the top, it has to start with policy. It has to start with the national government. So for us as a private company, we're always gonna look at the tax laws, for example. Do we have tax exemptions so that we can bring solar products in so that they're tax-free? What is the country's mini-grid policy? So, for example, South Sudan has a 7% electrification rate, and that is almost exclusively in Juba, the capital. When we look at Africa, 60% of the population is in rural areas, but only 5% of rural areas are electrified. That means all these areas need access to electrification, and the best way to do this is through decentralized renewable energy solutions. In a lot of these countries, it's just not feasible that the national grid is going to make it to all of these rural areas. So we look at mini-grids as a solution, but mini-grids is something that private companies can come in and do, but they have to be bankable. And that is only determined through the tariffs which are set by the national government. If the tariffs are not set high enough, private companies cannot come in and make this bankable. And of course they need financing, so it's all tied up together. So we look a lot at policy as being the first thing that needs to be put in place. The second thing that's really important to us as a private sector is financing. So here this week, I've heard about how there's so much money available for climate change and renewable energy. I can tell you, as a locally owned African company, we are not able to access that financing. It's just not there. UNCDF recently shared a report about money that was being dispersed for solar energy companies in Uganda. Only 3% of that funding went to locally owned companies. It's not getting to local companies, and part of the problem of that is the financing, is the language, is the preparation. There's a lot of it to it, but if we want to really electrify Africa and really do the last mile distribution, we have got to include local companies in that. Also, we work in frontier markets. We need electrification. When I go and pitch building a solar project to financiers, it is so hard to find a financier that is willing to build in South Sudan or Central African Republic. So if you really want to electrify Africa, you need to have financiers that are willing to come in and build in these countries. I understand that everybody's risk adverse and that you have to get your ROI, but at the end of the day, there has to be companies there that are willing to come in and provide that financing. And then finally, when we're looking at what can bring about the economic and social impact for these communities, there's some really great organizations that are out there that are doing a ground-up approach. So they go into communities that don't have electricity, and they say, what do you guys need? What is your current demand, and potentially, what do you want to electrify? And by doing this bottom-up approach, they can create mini-grids that bring in productive use equipment, like maize milling, cold room storage, water pumping, all of these things. And so if we're bringing about these holistic approaches, these kind of things are what's going to make the impact and bring the biggest economic and social value to communities across Africa. It has to be a coalition, and we've got to work together. Public, private, and NGO sector, we have to come together.
Thank you. That's music to my heart, coming from a multi-stakeholder network, obviously. But let's turn to you, Gloria. You have a big ask list, I guess, to the government. Governments have a big responsibility, national governments. There is really this question, energy as an enabler is fundamental. So what are the preconditions needed to generate a real economic and social value from the government side? And how do you push this forward? Because we also realize that it's not only about the system. So how do you connect with the finance ministries and urban planning and so on? Would be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Good afternoon, thank you. I got lost, so my apologies for coming late. At least I've seen the presentation. I would like to say that as government, we have a central role to play in terms of ensuring that before we develop the policies, we need to understand the environment. I know a lot of numbers are being thrown in here in terms of access is 5%, is so much, But what we have learned as governments is that as part of our census programs, we look for energy data in terms of what is our access levels and what is it people are using as energy forms. Because with that information, it then informs policy development, which has to be quite comprehensive, and we need to be able to also get different views from the public, from the private sector, from our financing institutions. And at that policy development stage, we are then able to feel what are the issues and the needs from the different parties which will be part of the solution. So we then have to come up with the plans, and in that plan, that's when we can come up with the financing options and what we need to do. But when I was looking at the issue in terms of what are the preconditions which we need, I believe that whilst Africa still has the lowest levels of access, Africa remains one of the richest continents in terms of resource availability, in terms of energy resources, in terms of critical minerals. And what we need as Africa is not donations, but what we need is economic development right at the extraction level, where we are able to be part of this new transition. We are currently receiving a lot of panels from China, Europe, all different countries, like, just to name a few. And the various accessories related to the energy transition are coming from different countries. But if you go to the critical minerals, Africa has some of the biggest resources of those critical minerals. And if Africa is capacitated at extraction level to develop this new economy at extraction, so that we become part of the production of the equipment we need for the transition. Because at the moment, we are basically standing aside and someone is extracting the minerals, value-adding them, and then selling to us, and then asking us to look for the financing, which is not coming. And then we are told to come up with all these wonderful policies. The policies will not cut it. We need to be capacitated as Africans to be able to be part of this new transition and be able to be part of the full value chain, with the beneficiation starting at extraction level. That way we are then building the communities. Why coal has remained core, especially in Southern Africa, is because coal is an economy. From the extraction, the processing, the selling, the plants themselves need people to man them and keep them going. So I believe that some of the preconditions is to relook at this whole value chain and say what is it Africa is bringing to the table, and how can we capacitate them to be an equal partner, not someone who just needs to be given something. So I'm throwing something out there to say, let's relook at this whole equation. But from a policies, institutions, we have done that as Africans. We have come up with renewable energy policies. We have come up with laws. We have developed institutions which will allow for private sector participation. But where is the money going to come from? And in some of our countries, we have looked at our own institutions to start the process. Because if we are looking for external parties to come in with the money, it's not happening. So those are some of the issues which I'll just throw in there as preconditions to say, let's relook at this whole equation. It's not adding up.
So basically, if I may reformulate, you're asking a seat at the table where the rules are being defined of the game we play. Okay, I'm turning now from national government to city perspective, because I think this is to some extent also one of the challenges some cities might encounter in several countries. So what are the preconditions you are specifically looking for to have renewable energy as a real economic and social value?
Thank you, everyone. I like that I'm sitting between the private. I like that I'm sitting between the private sector and government. And that is exactly where cities and local government sit. So usually government makes all the laws and the policies, but we are sitting where service delivery occurs and where people occur and where things actually, the implementation actually happens. So I'm going to touch on some of the soft things. So
We don't hear. Do you mind to move this to you? I think no,
Okay.
move it closer to you, or you move closer to Mike. I think.
okay, I hope I'm audible now. Oh, is it? It needs to be. Okay. Is this better? Can you say something? Hi, everyone.
We really want to make sure to hear you. So.
Okay, so as I was saying, cities are sort of the middle ground between government, the private sector, and also the citizens, where real implementation of the national policies actually happen and where service delivery actually happens. So when we're talking about energy or electricity, it is at the city level where power goes from the grid to your house, if we're talking about the traditional energy model. So now when we talk about the transition, I'm going to touch on a few, I'll call them soft things for the purpose of this discussion. But it's about understanding that the current model, the current energy model that we have in most of our countries and in most of our cities, it has not really worked for the people that it's serving. So if we were simply to just plug and play and just remove coal and replace it with with renewable energy, but we have not changed the systems and the way of doing business, then we're not really going to impact on the social and the economic aspects that we're talking about in terms of the people that these services are supposed to serve. So for me, and looking at it from a city perspective where implementation is happening, it's about thinking about the social and economic aspect and the current conditions of the people that are living in those communities currently. She's described some of the countries where electrification levels are still very low. So we need to start by looking at what has been the problem in the past and how do we do things differently coming forward. And the way we do things differently is through intention, but also through collaboration. So what I mean by intention, last week we had a workshop, an energy workshop at the city of Joburg, the city that I work with from C40. And we were talking about renewable energy provision for informal settlements. So the city of Joburg has agreed and most people are connected, but we've got informal settlements who technically cannot be connected to the grid because of the nature of the structures that are informal and so on. So the city is now trying to understand how do we design a system that can be suitable for informal settlement, because as much as they're informal, they're still citizens of the city and they still need energy provision. So one of the participants raised a question to say one of the questions that or the challenges that we're going to encounter when we go to the informal settlements to have this discussion with them is, why are they not getting the same level of power as the other formal households? Why are they getting a different solution? So that really forced us to take a step back and look at what is it that we provide to people based on what we think we should be providing and who we think they are. So most of the time when we talk about intention, it's like, okay, we're going to build a solar panel, we're going to put up solar panels, we're going to put up a wind farm, and then the social aspect is usually the afterthoughts. So, but if we include the social and the economic aspect and the people that these solutions are meant for in the beginning, then it's not an afterthought to say, oh, okay, these rural women have been using sewing machines. So we're just going to give them sewing machines that run on renewable energy. But we don't actually ask them, do you want to be a seamstress or would you rather be doing something else? Then we provide a solution that is tailored to their needs. So in cities, in the 40 cities, what we've been working on through our climate action plans is that these climate action plans don't only consider the goals that the cities want to achieve in terms of mitigation and in terms of adaptation and in terms of the percentage of renewable energy in the city, in the system, but they also consider what are the social and the economic aspects that are associated with those things. In South Africa, mostly we speak about the just transition. So in designing those systems and in our planning, and not just policy planning, but planning for project-specific things, we already include that intention to look at the social and the economic aspect and the impact of who are the people that are going to be affected. And then the other important component is co-creation. So it's all good and well to go sit somewhere and design a solution that you will think will work for people. But if the people that the solution is being designed for are not part of that co-creation, then it will not work. So who are these people? It's national government, it's private companies working with local government at all spheres, from national to local government. And also with the people on the ground who are actually going to receive these services and asking them, what is it that you need? What is the solution that you need? And how do we create this together so that we're making a solution that will actually uplift your life, not for our stats, but for what is actually needed. And then there's the issue of capacity, which has already been touched on, and skills. And again, the capacity and the skills that are needed might not be what we imagine, but if we do not have those dialogues and those conversations, we are not going to know what all those things are. So we can talk about local manufacturing and all those things, but what is it truly that people need? And we need to understand that, and that is part of the things that cities have been doing, to have those dialogues and to understand. And in a way, cities are placed in such a way that they already interact daily through service delivery with their citizens, so they really understand some of those needs. And even when private sector comes along, I think it's important to go to those city stakeholders to understand what are your challenges, what are you dealing with, what are your citizens facing, and what do we need to address. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you're raising super important points here. Ahmed, what is your view on this, especially after hearing it's about inclusion? To some extent, it is reverse engineering from the people and their needs, and then deciding what we need to put at the beginning, right? So what are your thoughts on this? And again, it's probably also about the real economic and social value we are creating, but what rules do we need to set and change?
Thank you very much, and great pleasure to be part of this discussion and this panel. Thank you very much for the invitation, for having me. When I was looking at the note for the panel, one of the issues raised was opening new spaces and new narratives around renewables. And in Africa, and with against this background of all this transformation. So I'm going to touch upon two issues in particular. The first one, because we're talking about climate, we're the COP. This is the COP of implementation, huge emphasis on adaptation and finance. So the first issue is the role of renewables in climate adaptation. And I think this is something that is still not, that role and that contribution to renewables to climate adaptation is something that I don't think is yet sufficiently recognized, acknowledged, highlighted, scaled up, whether it's in the policy frameworks, whether it's in the funding and the financing. One example, if you look at the NDCs, updated NDCs for the Paris Agreement, I think of 190 NDCs, only 60 tag renewables for climate adaptation, so around 30%. And renewables for climate adaptation are critical as an enabler of water security, for food security, resilience for communities who are the front line of climate disasters. This is all very critical for them. So I think there's huge space still to address this issue and to take this issue forward. And then I'm going to do the link of this dynamic with the area I'm currently working, which is all the area around fragility and conflict. As you know, Africa is the continent with the greatest number of armed conflicts, terrorism, death, and a very volatile peace and security landscape. And that impacts hugely on all development efforts on planning, on scaling up climate, energy, you name it. And there's a huge development loss as a result of that. And just to mention, and that does not include just conflict-affected countries. If you take a country like Nigeria, northern Nigeria is really the hotspot of the Boko Haram insurgency. Development loss out of this insurgency in the past 7 years is around $7 billion. So this is the landscape where we're deploying renewables in Africa. And I think all the MDBs, the IFIs, there's a huge thing called the fragility agenda, where you're trying to address countries that are in conflict, but also now countries who are in conflict and facing, or going out of conflict and facing climate disaster. Look at a country like South Sudan. Half of it is flooded, with huge humanitarian crisis. And I think Renewable also has a role in that space, and I think it has not also been sufficiently highlighted, of bringing the fragility agenda together with the energy access and renewable agenda together, and energy access through renewables, decentralized renewables, as again strengthening the ability of communities to be resilient, to face these challenges, to prevent displacement. It's huge. Estimated that 100 million Africans will be displaced by 2050. So I think there's a huge space, again, to a new narrative to bring forward around that. And this is the space where my organization works through a forum called the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development. And that is a forum that Egypt launched in 2018 to bring together the conversation between peace, security, and sustainable development. And we've not had yet sufficiently this bringing in energy in it in the way we want, the energy nexus with water and food in a context of increased climate impact. And within that context and the climate and security context, just to mention also that out of this Aswan Forum at COP last Saturday, the COP presidency launched an initiative called Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace, which is how we can mobilize climate adaptation, climate finance to address fragility, to strengthen peace-building agenda in Africa. And again, there's a role for renewables in that space that it could be very interesting to take forward. And in particularly on the issue of financing. Africa gets only 4% of climate financing. Conflict-affected countries in Africa who are also facing climate disaster get 1/80th of that. It's unbelievable. So this is an issue of climate justice. It's an issue of climate justice. That those who are suffering most and most vulnerable to both climate and conflict and humanitarian crisis are getting the least of climate finance, and we see how climate finance can be instrumental. As you said, we hear about a lot of resources around for also renewables and energy access. So these are huge challenges that I think we would look forward to work with IRENA. IRENA has done great work on renewables, on the access, on the socioeconomic benefits, and how can we think together of bringing that work with the fragility work and addressing the root causes of fragility and conflict. And I think with the type of analysis you have already done, I think there's huge synergies and potential also with the work of other organizations in this space to raise this new narrative around these issues. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So basically, we probably need to reformulate our question and say, like, generate real economic and social value and peace. Now, building on this, maybe just to share one part, we have recently launched a UNEC report, and Ukraine was part of it, and we realized that 90% of the solar and wind installation had been destroyed, but they have only been partially destroyed. So basically, in a post-conflict perspective, this is indeed, and I think it's supporting the fact that renewable energy is basically strengthening the adaptability actually, and resilient infrastructure to climate, but also in conflict context. So let me turn back to you, Rabia, because I know that, so after hearing those things, there are fundamental rules to change, but we also see like, and I know that you in particular always point out, and you have mentioned it, the institutional fabrics, the international trade agreement which do exist, and that we also need to change things that are in place since many, many years. So what are your thoughts hearing the different contributions?
Thank you. Afterwards, I have a question for Ahmed, but you know, I just wrote down Bretton Woods institutions. I feel like we're having the same conversation since those institutions have been in place, so post-World War II. And so I think this is the systemic nature of the problem that needs to be addressed if we want to address some of the challenges. As you said, I mean, there is finance, there is, or so they say. In some countries, you know, the policy framework is there. In others, institutions are strong enough. I'm not saying in all of them, but there are examples of all of that. And yet, things are not coming. I mean, Diala and I were in Zambia a few weeks ago, and that's why I'm talking about the Bretton Woods institutions. And we were in a room of extremely competent people who know exactly what they're doing, what they're talking about, etc. Utilities, TSOs. And then Zambia almost defaulted from its debt. So like a few weeks before we arrived, the IMF, Bretton Woods institution, had provided another loan. So, but as a result of that, there were clauses attached to the new loan that doesn't allow Zambia to give sovereign guarantee for any renewable energy project. So in 3 years, they're going to default again, and they're going to have more money from the IMF, and then more clauses. I mean, it's just like a virtuous circle, right? So what do we do? And this is why I'm saying, I think all these issues that we're discussing, they've been there on the table since post-World War II. They're not new. I mean, what is new is the climate, you know, challenge, of course, and all the urgency for dealing with these challenges. But the systemic nature of it comes from an international system that is made to serve the interests of a few at the expense of a majority, and that's global north versus global south. So that's my take on it. So that's why I really think that on the table, and of course, the minute you start talking about these things, nobody wants to hear and nobody wants to discuss. Maybe the little sort of ray of optimism that I have is that something like the pandemic destroyed one of the most important aspects of supply chain regulation in the world, which the World Trade Organization was, you know, the minute India had the local content requirement on solar PV, it was a disaster, etc. When we know that local content requirement was, or industrial policies were everywhere in many countries, and that this didn't disturb anybody. So maybe something is changing a little bit there, but I think at the table we need to discuss that. That's the most, to me, the most important, because all the others will sort of, can be not solved, but at least we can move the discussion a bit further. My question to you, Ahmed, was as you were talking about Nigeria, and I know the risk return profile is very different with oil and gas. But we've had major investment in Nigeria in oil and gas for decades. It didn't disturb anyone that there were such huge crises there. How do you see that?
No, I mean, it's the classic rentier economy in Africa. Sorry. I mean, it's well documented, the challenges that are raised by this industry in Nigeria also. I mean, but I think it's part of a global system, as you mentioned. But I have some hope, actually, because the scale of climate disasters that is happening, and we're only at the beginning of it. If you see what happened in Pakistan, it is, the Prime Minister said it when he was here and I was at the round table, it's apocalyptic. $30 billion of economic loss. And they were saying, are we supposed to service our debt and take the money from the emergency relief? The same thing is going to happen in Africa and elsewhere, etc. So the scale of economic damage brought by climate and of disaster, I think, will push the boundaries of all the established frameworks we have. And they call precisely for holistic and integrated responses that don't act in silos, and it's all interconnected in terms of the financial system, the climate responses, and all other aspects.
Thank you. I think I'm going to turn this to Gloria, because I feel this is also a part, ultimately it's, so when we're speaking about the energy transition, we need the finance ministers around the table, we need the economic ministers around the table, trade, and if it was separate, because we are talking about changing the fundamental economic system and structures in place since many years. And maybe to say like a few people are benefiting from it, I think we see very similar structures when we speak about fossil fuel and renewable energy. So basically, how do we create the disruption? And maybe for you, Gloria, also because you spoke about data. I was just before on a panel on transport and the energy transition, and basically a colleague from the Islamic Development Bank spoke about the fact we need to have much better analysis and data on the cost benefit and also the cost of non-action. So basically probably collecting the data of what are the amounts going into Pakistan, the flooding, into hurricanes, into drought, etc., to collect this so that governments and also financial institutions really understand that the system is broken if we don't address this. I would be interested to hear how you're handling such a discussion in Gabon, actually, Do you try to have those data too? Because you spoke about energy data, energy needs, but do you also connect this to the data on economic benefits and losses?
Thank you. I think this is part of the data which people have not been maybe talking to. If you look at Africa, I'll just use an example of the issue of access. And when you talk about access, and the lack of clean cooking for women, the time they spend to go and look for that firewood, travel long distances, spending time before they even come to cook in a room which is full of smoke, that cost of the time which has been put in there and the cost of providing a much cleaner option for a maybe more efficient stove, and also the cost of the time they've spent looking for that firewood, they are usually not quantified. It's information which is there, but we don't then analyze it further to say what are the trade-offs, what is it which we need to do to improve the quality of life, and what is the cost to that person? Because most of women's work is not paid for, especially the caregiving, the cooking. So it's not quantified. So these are some of the issues which we are saying as governments we need to look at the total cost of not providing the right solution, especially the clean and renewable energy resources. Then the other issue which I want to bring into the fray is the issue of the actual cost of the renewables themselves in terms of affordability, because you are looking at these rural communities which are at subsistence level, and then you want to provide them with these cleaner resources, but are they able to afford them from their subsistence living? So what we have done as government is to look at these trade-offs to say the issue of costs of the new renewables for these communities, the affordability, and we come up with programs which then capacitate them to be able to be productive. So when you are coming up with some of these renewable energy resources, we want the solutions which don't just address the clean and nice to have energy, but also capacitate the communities to consume and also improve on their well-being in general. So when we look at our rural master plan, it also comes with equipment where we are capacitating the rural communities to produce more through irrigation systems, to value add their produce so that they dry it, maybe using solar, and they're able to then sell it. They reduce the post-harvest losses. We bring them in processing systems like mills, which will then process their products for them to be able to sell them and then be capacitated to afford this more expensive resource, which is also being brought to them as a way of improving their ability to consume it. Because it's not about just giving them, but they have to be capacitated to then sustain it. And it's the same with regards to cooking, where we want to bring them biodigesters instead of LPG gas, which they have to look for money to buy, but you want them to capacitate them to be able to produce the gas through the building of biogas systems, which they can feed using their own animals and able to get this cleaner way of cooking, but also get from the decomposition of that bio-waste fertilizer to improve on their capacity to produce more products. So there's these trade-offs.
May I challenge you, a very quick follow-up question, and then you can enter, because if we're speaking about not assessing the cost of non-action or the time you see going to for the cooking part, or assessing affordability, do we not need to change the economic system, how we define affordability? So that basically all economic measures and assessment of an action or non-action is basically changed, and that whatever investment decisions we are taking, investing in renewable energy will be more affordable because the alternatives are actually no inclusive, no just, harmful for climate, health, etc. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Can you as a government impose another economic system, finance system, assessment of investment?
I think we can, because I think those systems are the ones which we are now using to come up with the new programs which I'm talking about. The cost of not supplying, the cost of not being able to have this sustainable resource. Because if you're looking at providing modern energy, you can use diesel, but is it going to be affordable? But if you use renewable energy sources, you have much more sustainability in the long term, and you have capacitation which might be much different. So I agree with you. It's important to consistently change the way we look at it and evaluate that cost of not being able to provide the resources, which at times is not fully quantified. But what I know is, even in the modern productive sector, the cost of non-renewables in the long term is much more expensive than putting in the renewable energy sources. So we need to do those models which show us the long-term impacts, which might look like we are resolving now by going through the other options, but have much longer term effects on affordability and actual sustainability in the long run.
Thank you. I'll play this back to you, actually, Rabia, because you also spoke about IMF and this example of Zambia. How do we, so if we all agree we need to change the rules, how do we change those rules systemically? What are the entry points? Are we able here to identify some key levers so that our action can also be more targeted and strategic? I know it's not an easy one, but you said we need to speak about those things, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, I don't think I'm the best place to answer that. My answer might be a bit too extreme. So let's be a little bit politically correct, no? I don't know how you change the rules of the game. In history, you know what is interesting about economic history is that when we are in a paradigm, we always think that's the natural one, there can be no other one. So, you know, when you had slavery, basically that was the economic model. And then, you know, I guess we progressed since then, as Marx would say, capitalism is a great progress in history. And it is in so many ways. So I don't know how you change paradigms, but historically, there have been trials of changing paradigms through maybe a bit violent means, so I'm not sure how to best address this issue, but we definitely need to, stepwise at least, reform some of the existing international rules that have led us to where we are today. And obviously, I think I agree with you, Ahmed. I mean, what shook up, you know, the system is the climate. There's the urgency of the climate, the consequences of climate change. I think COVID played a role. So pandemic was, I think, an important, you know, wake-up call. But I don't know. I think you can...
Maybe, yes, I'm going to ask this question actually to all of you, because I think this is where we need to... We seem to agree that basically what we have been doing in the past is not bringing us into the future. So the question, and I'm sorry, this was not on the script, but I think, like, let's jump into this. So how do we do this? What are entry points? Ahmed?
Thank you. I think this is an important conversation because it is useful to make us think then how we take it on the energy and renewables. But I think there's a combination of two things, of working within the process and also outside the process to influence the process and to... So, I mean, and I think the climate change regime where we are has seen these type of changes. I mean, 15 years ago in this regime, nobody used to talk about adaptation. It was not a term that many people were even familiar with. Look where we are on adaptation today. And then, better example also and more relevant to this COP, loss and damage. We had agenda item on loss and damage, agreed funding loss and damage, agreed at the beginning of the COP. It's huge. You know, so it shows that you can also push things in the process and make them happy in there. And existing rule can be scrapped, actually. And I think we have a very example in Europe recently about the energy charter. This energy that a number of countries decided to, who are very attentive to existing rules in general, to withdraw from it because they saw it as problematic in terms of fossil fuel investments and renewables, etc. So it shows that this can happen too. But again, you read a lot. You need to build the case to that. You need to mobilize and build the case around that, and it can happen with the right configuration and within this global landscape of increased and interconnected crises.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Laura. What are your thoughts?
This is not my forte, but so like we have to look at who's in power, like who's actually making those decisions, and we have to be able to change their minds. And to me, like. That has to come from collective action. Like nations need to be working together. Everyone needs to get together. We need to have the same message, and then we need to stand by it, and we need to leverage whatever power we do have to bring about this change. Like what I see in Uganda when COVID happened, and then the Ukraine war, and the prices of everything skyrocketed. His Excellency Yoweri Museveni. Everyone was complaining about the wheat prices, and he said, "Not a problem. Go eat cassava. Go figure out things locally and find local solutions, and we're going to handle this ourselves." So I think like that local content, people are moving more in that direction, but it has to be collective action. People have to work together and stand their ground.
Maybe just to build on this local action. We see climate change might actually be an opportunity. COVID might be an opportunity. Interruptions of supply chains might be an opportunity. Also because some players who have defined the rules need themselves to change the rules. What are your thoughts on this? And how do we create local value? How do we ensure local value creation everywhere? And if you don't want to answer that, that's okay. Then I'll just move on.
No, it's okay. I mean, I can say, like, actually, our company's really been affected by this. So with COVID and the supply chain, like, we've seen our shipping costs increase by 8 times. Products that we need to get, solar panels, batteries, it's taking forever to get them. We can't source them. So actually, we're looking at opening East Africa's first lithium-ion battery assembly plant in Uganda because it's such a mess. And so we're like, fine, if this is the way it's going to be, we're going to try to put this together ourselves. So I think that private sector can bring about those changes, but we absolutely have to have support of local, like, government in that, bringing in policies for investment, bringing in policies to support manufacturing. Yeah, there's a lot of pieces that can come together, but I think that we will see those changes. Yeah.
And it's really exciting to hear that you're thinking about like this battery plant, right, in Uganda?
Yeah. Yep.
That's
so
great news.
We're going to do that. Yeah. Looking for funding. Free plug.
Okay, so we have a funding call here too, so that's a great panel. Sorry. City's voice. Where do you see critical entry points to change the rules?
I think it has to start with collective action, as has already been said, and we need some sort of disruption. So where I come from, I'll constantly talk about Joburg. People have been very innovative in finding their own solutions to things and creating their own economies. And for instance, in Joburg and in South Africa in general, and even in other neighboring countries, we've got these informal waste collectors that have just started organizing themselves and collecting all the recycles because they saw a gap in the market and they didn't have jobs. And somebody said, actually, if you collect these cans of paper, tins, and everything, you can actually make a few rands. And they organized themselves and started doing that. So in most cases, what we see is that on the ground, people are willing to try new things and to change. And in some instances, it is that lack of support from policy-wise, which is where also local government can come in with supportive bylaws that allow for that innovation and creation from people. And also the support from private companies and funding. So a lot of times you find that people actually come up with their own solutions, as I've given an example. But because there's no support policy-wise and there's no support funding-wise, those things are not actually actualized. And we also see, in terms of international funding, it is really, really hard for local people, even cities themselves, to tap into international funding. It always has to be associated with some other international trusted organization for you to gain that trust and to get those resources. So until we remove all that red tape about who's good enough, who's not good enough, who's not trustworthy, then we actually, taking the air out of that innovation that naturally exists. And yeah, until we take out those bottlenecks, and I know it's like things that take a long time to do, but then we've also witnessed, like, I'm gonna reveal my age now. When I was little, we used to have landlines, and in the span of me being 4 years old and me being however old I am now, we've moved
So
to
you're
not
not really
only
revealing
cell
it.
phones, but smartphones. So that transition happened really quickly. So sometimes we also need to learn from other transitions and how they happened, how did they get it right, and also how did they get it wrong, and also just look outside of our bubble.
Thank you, Rodani. And please apologize. So apologies from my side because I said like city's voice, which is completely stupid just because I had a blank on your name. So sorry for that. So I'm going to turn to you. Do you have questions? Do you have ideas? Where are the disruptions? Anybody wants to step forward? I think you're just sitting too far away. Yes, over there. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to run to you actually because... Oh, you come to me. Great. We come to each other.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So I came a little bit late to this session, and I just hope that what I have to say hasn't been said here previously. So we're talking about the shifts to renewables, and I'm speaking from the angle of an African. I am Nigerian, and I'm thinking Nigeria relies a lot on its coal, oil, and gas exports. And now we're talking about the shift to renewable energy. I mean, it's very healthy for the environment. It's going to reduce some of the environmental disasters that we are seeing in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, where we have most of the oil refineries. So I just want to ask this. In the case of Nigeria, in the case of the other African countries that have this abundance of oil, how realistic, this is a question, how realistic is it for us to make the move to the renewable energy without so much hurting the economies of this country? Thank you.
Thank you so much for it. I'll come back to you, but I think this was one of the questions we also had planned initially, which is how do we ensure that economy that might, and I think you built on this also, Rabia, in your presentation, economy that are for the moment built around fossil fuel can make this transition happen, and that they are also an inclusive part of the transition, that there is, so how do we address it? How do we bring the losers, so to say, into the winner's side? Rabia, do you want to... okay, please, Rodani.
So that's a very good question, and it affects a lot of our African countries and also cities. And C40 did a study on green jobs in Johannesburg, but what we've also understood is that the jobs that are being created in the green sector and the renewable energy sector are not necessarily going to replace the jobs that are lost in other sectors. So it's not like if you're creating 100 jobs and then you've made up for the other 30 jobs that were lost, because they're not the same. So one of the important factors that we have to look at is about reskilling. So that people that are in sectors that are going to lose jobs then are reskilled so that they can be able to also operate in the new sector or in the new system. But reskilling is not always possible for everybody. So we also have to look at support packages, so that can come from the private sector, from government, in terms of supporting those people that are going to lose their jobs, that are going to lose their livelihood in this transition. And it's not only a diesel mechanic losing their job or a diesel plant operator losing their job. It's also the indirect jobs that come from that. So if you have a coal power station, you will have somebody outside who's catering for those operators at lunch. That person is also losing their job. It might not be possible to move them across the country to a wind farm to sell their fat cakes there for lunch. So we have to think about how we support those people, and also creating other economies that can support and create maybe even new livelihoods that didn't exist in those areas before. And yeah, that is something that as cities we've also been looking at. For instance, in the city of Ekurhuleni, also in Gauteng, we've been supporting setting up a just transition forum where the city interacts with all its stakeholders, businesses, the civil society and government, and also the citizens in how we address those kind of job losses and impact, because we really need to understand what is being lost, what is being gained in order to make up for those losses. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Gloria, you were going to jump into.
I think she has said most of what I wanted to say, but also the transition is going to be a process. And each country will have to come up with a plan in terms of how they will then decarbonize. So I think it's important that we look at that. It's not going to be overnight. So that planning and the creation of alternative economies around the new renewables is quite critical. I think that's one of the points which I raised earlier on. And then the other issue is that of research and development. I have somewhere in my mind as an engineer that a solution can be found to clean up those, whether it's coal, whether it's gas, which will then help us to still use those resources. I think we did it with COVID, we've done it with so many things. They might look like it's a challenge now, but with research and development, we can come up with alternatives which can resolve the same issue using other absorbent materials which can be developed in these coming years, which might change the whole issue of how we deal with some of these so-called dirty coals. But if you look at goal number 7, it also looks at some of the transitional fuels like gas, that we will still need to use gas, and Nigeria is one of those countries which is rich in gas, and that's a transitional fuel which we'll need to use in the meantime before we eventually come up with the alternatives. Obviously, the issues of reskilling and looking at the alternative issues. But what is key for me is that as we adopt these new systems, as African countries, as countries which will be affected, we need to develop new economies around these new systems so that we are part and parcel of the new economies.
Yeah.
It's important because if we are not part of that, then it won't work for us. But I really feel that it's important that the critical minerals have to be value added. They have to be developed. The same economy we have around coal should be developed around other minerals. Thank you.
I see there are lots of questions. Maybe just one thing to say, cleaning up natural gas and natural gas bridging fuel, I think it's really important that we take into account the realities of every single economy, but there are so many economies that are no natural gas producers. They are dependent on imports, and they might actually have a real alternative by developing a renewable economy. So I think it's really important that we differentiate here too. And I had like 1 question, 2 questions, 3 questions.
Hi, first of all, thank you for your presentation so far. My name is Anans Michalopoulos, I'm a journalist for Euractiv in Brussels. It's a more political question. I mean, there is no doubt that in order for Africa to go green, foreign investments will be needed. My question is, do you believe that, do you fear actually that this push for this green transition may lead to a new geopolitical battleground among foreign powers in Africa, taking advantage, of course, of your need to move on, I mean, to go towards the green way? And the second thing is that considering that this battle indirectly already exists, do you fear that the clash of these, the business of these interests may prevent Africa from speeding up these necessary reforms. Thank you.
May I ask you to keep the questions short because we are
Yes.
running out of time, and thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, my name is Alan Bigelow from Solar Cookers International, and I have been also baffled by this process that we're going through right now of trying to make the transition happen. If you look at the CO2 in the atmosphere over time, the Keeling curve, it just keeps going up, 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 and at an accelerating rate. So I've been wondering and struggling about this. Are we doing the right thing? Meeting at COP meetings, the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and asking myself, is there a better way? I haven't been able to come up with a better solution at this time. If I've heard someone evoke deities, gods, to come in and do this for us, or artificial intelligence, but I worry about those solutions. I think that we have a very good structure here now to work with, but to add to that, because I'm worrying about the transition taking too much time, and talking about bridge fuels. I think we need to bring in more of the household level aspects, and the individual, hearing about collective action is a great approach. And we at Solar Cookers International have been collecting data that show that people save money by using a solar oven in areas where the communities are vulnerable, but meanwhile there's a tremendous amount of sunshine. So this solution I think is great, but we need more of those solutions. Could we have a database of solutions for individuals to access and bring into their lives on a daily basis? So that's my question, is to call for a database, and maybe REN 21 is building this. Thank you.
We had another question here.
Thank you, Rena. So I didn't want to ask a question. I just wanted to make an intervention about the disruptions when we were talking about them. I think that this is the first time we talk about the structural change needs in such an open way. And I think this is a good starting point, because when we started talking about localizing supply chains 10 years ago, it was in such an environment where it was a bit daring to talk about these topics, and this is where we have reached today. So I think maybe this is now a starting point to say, okay, for 10 years we have been talking about the same things and we have reached the wall, basically. And maybe now this is the time that we can start talking about the real topics. And maybe we can say that this is not within our mandate ourselves, but this is true. This issue is beyond the energy sector. This issue goes way beyond. So maybe now it's time to open the door to other sectors and to really start the discussion here and see where it goes. And just one other thing, I think that now we are in the decade of influencers and influencing, and I think, we have people like you who do influence young people to think about these things. And it starts there. It starts with the young people really opening their eyes to the existence of other systems and other ways of doing things. And so I think this is also another starting point to really start bringing the young people to think about outside of the box and see where it takes us. Maybe the second pandemic will actually do something. So thank you for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you very much. So basically we're asking for a second pandemic, but I'm actually not sure we're really asking for it. So who would like to take the questions? Or comment on the questions, I think. Yes, please, Gloria, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. I think one of the issues he raised is, what other solutions do we have outside what we are prescribing now as the need to change the CO2 emission growth? And I think if you look at the projections, they are going to go up first before they go down, because we need to do much more. But I believe that disruptions are going to happen. They will happen. There's a lot of new ideas which young people are coming up with, which will come up with maybe different solutions from what we're talking about today. And that will change, depending on where the disruption is happening, that will change that political influence in the question which you asked, because like I said earlier on, as Africans, we feel that because of the intellectual property rights and also the developed economies which have already developed economies of scale, we might not be able to compete in terms of actual production of equipment, but we would want to be part of the economy where with some of the critical minerals which are used for these resources, they come from some of our economies, and we need to be able to talk about this. And for me, collective action as Africans and as those economies which need to get more from that, from the critical minerals will need to happen. So I'm not a politician, so I will not be able to project what are the potential interests which can come up. But I believe that everyone has the interest of wanting to ensure that they sell their products to someone else. And at times it comes so strongly that we lose our focus in terms of, as Africans, we want to develop first and foremost, and we need to develop in a manner, and we have an opportunity to do it in a clean manner because we don't have access already. So we can adopt these new technologies, but people have to meet us halfway, somewhere, where we access long-term patient capital on an equal basis, like she said, not because we have to go through NGOs and other third parties which are more trusted than us. Yeah. So I just think I'll leave it there and ask others to. But I agree, we need a database of inventions and new issues and sharing of ideas in terms of how we can make this transition work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, we are running out of time. There was a question which is coming on my phone here because I have another blank. That's not good. Sorry. There, I have it. If basically you fear that Africa may end up being a geopolitical battleground among great powers in this push for green transition, considering that foreign investment will be needed. That's straight to the point about one of the challenges we need to address. So maybe I'm going to ask you for having closing remarks, each of you. Please be short, but have basically, if you have something to say about the question of fear and the battleground, also have a comment on this. Gloria, would you want to add something on this, or can we move to... Okay. Okay, good. So we'll just go it up here. Please, your last comments.
I think it's important that when we think about transition and when we think about technologies and all the other problems in the world, that we stop to think about the real people that are impacted by our actions, whether it be from a local government, from the private sector, from government, or from multinationals. And that should really inform how we move forward, because I think a lot of what has happened is that we take people out of the equation and we make decisions that affect their lives without them. Yeah.
Okay. People run the table at all levels. Laura.
I would like to end on a positive note. Kind of the exciting thing about working on this transition now is that right now we have the best technology we've ever had, right? So actually Africa has the potential to build a smarter and more efficient grid than what exists in the West right now. And that's something to really look forward to, and we can do it. Obviously we need the resources, but the technology is there. So if we come together, we can make it happen.
And we need to ensure that everybody has also access to technology and not only to renewable resources, right?
Thank you. Maybe just quickly on the question that was raised. I think there's overemphasis on external actors in Africa and what they're doing and what do they want. And in fact, actually, Africans themselves, they know what they want. They have their objectives. They have their national interests. As we see in COP, they have a lot of initiatives and ideas, and they want to engage with others based on what they want. And this is where we should focus, you know, and how they pursue this. And I think it has been said that this is a country, this is a continent that is full of resources, riches, potential, capacities, youth, entrepreneurs, technology. And I think it needs just also, we need to ensure that the global system works also towards pushing that drive forward and supporting them and taking it forward. And that's what at least Egypt is trying to do through this COP. Thank you.
Thank you. Rabia.
Thanks. I couldn't agree more. So African demand, I'm hoping that what we're doing right now on this whatever green pact, that what you call as a green pact, will help in that directions. And some countries indeed, like Egypt and others, are moving in that direction. I would say one more thing, is that the continent has resources, it has the capacities, it needs to leverage them for its development. But given the climate crisis and the carbon budget that is remaining, I think out of equity and justice consideration, the global north needs to get its act together. It needs to look at its production and consumption pattern. They were able to mobilize billions of dollars in no time in order to deal with their issues of energy security. Energy security has been a problem for decades in Africa. Where is the money? The money has to come from the global north. It's not charity, it's Africa's right.
To be honest, after those words, I'm not even going to add anything, because I think it's a perfect closing to those great discussions. I would like to thank all of you for having all those voices together, and also for playing the game of speaking about the things we have more difficulties in bringing basically into the spaces. Thanks to all for your participation.
Yes.